will allow us to communicate back with you on today's webinar. Now, we will be sending out evaluations, and if you're needing CEU credits, you can get those via this mechanism as well. So, again, if you have any questions, please post them to the question area, and we'll take care of those throughout the session. So, are you using Google Apps? Here in North Carolina, we've got a lot of different folks that are using Google Apps all across the state, from our K-12 to higher ed, as well as past education. There are also schools using it, companies using Google Apps. In North Carolina alone, with just in our traditional K-12 environment, we have 69 school districts that are using their Google Apps service for email, documents, sites, everything along those lines. Now, we've got a few that aren't necessarily using it for email and the whole suite. They're using it just for the document side. It's completely up to you how you want to use it. So today we're going to take a look at several different pieces. For instance, we're going to look at the Google Apps directory sync, where you can synchronize your directory service such as eDirectory, Active Directory, or just an open LDAP server. We can also synchronize to that. We'll also be taking a look at the Google Apps password sync tool. So if you are an Active Directory environment, your users can have a simulation of a single sign-on environment where they use one username, one password to synchronize all of their data. And we'll be taking a look at that. Then we have Google Apps Manager. Now, you may be a directory service environment, you may not. But in either case, you can take advantage of Google Apps Manager. Google Apps Manager will give you reports that you can't pull from the administration console and a lot of different types of things. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A. So Google Apps Directory Sync. Whether you are an Active Directory, eDirectory, or an LDAP server environment, we can synchronize your directory from your local server up to Google. Now remember, with these tools, Google never actually interacts with your directory service. It's always us pushing to Google Apps. So Google never has actually access to your directory service. Now at the same time, GADS is a one-way sync pushing that information. We can also use GADS to push profile information. Profile information being what school personnel are at, what phone numbers are, and different types of things along those lines. We'll take a look at that information here in a few minutes. We can select individual pieces. If there's only certain pieces that you want to synchronize with Google, we can choose those individual pieces and be able to push them up to Google Apps as well. And then, of course, there's also that we can support multiple directory environments. So we have one school district here in North Carolina that we're actually synchronizing 3 different directory structures. We've got an Active Directory, an eDirectory, and also a Lotus Notes environment that we're synchronizing with Google at this current time. Now, we can add in multiple directories as well. So if you have a staff directory and a student directory, and they're separated, we can bring them together in your Google domain to be one single directory structure. Google Apps Password Sync. Now, you're never actually giving your password to your directory service and things along those lines to Google, unless you're actually synchronizing that email address with Google. Now, at the same time, it's a one-way push. Google's never accessing your server. You're always pushing passwords to Google. So in an Active Directory environment, when your users change their password, then it will automatically push that password up to Google Apps for you. Now, it's also managed from your Active Directory and Active Directory only. We're not able to do this with any other tools at this time. There are some third-party hacks or ways that you can do it with the eDirectory if you want to, but by default there's not necessarily a way to do the password synchronization without being on Active Directory. Now as well, You must install Google Apps Password Sync on all of your directories that could possibly allow a user to change their password. So if you've got a directory at every school that is their home directories and they're actually authenticating against that server, you will have to synchronize that server up to Google, because if they were to change their password on that server, we want it to push their password up to Google from there. If there is an additional attribute that you want to use, if you look on our screen here, you can see that we're asking what the mail attribute is. Well, if that attribute was actually something different where you were pulling your email address, we can actually populate that in a different way as well. And we'll take a look at that a little further here in just a few minutes. So then we also have the Google Apps Manager. Google Apps Manager is your way of seeing more information about your console than what you can see in the web interface. So we can pull reports, we can script user creation, we can script a lot of different things. Now, I've got one district that they don't currently have their Active Directory environment running, but every year we have to create students, we have to move students, we have to suspend students, whatever the case may be. So we use Google Apps Manager to script that process to where we can disable all student accounts and then only re-enable the ones that we need to. As well, we can also push new accounts to Google Apps in that manner. So for that domain, we've got somewhere around 23,000 students that we're managing through the command line interface. Now, if you notice from our command line, you can see that we can also see the maximum number of users that we can create for our domain, as well the number of users that we're currently using. And we'll take a look at this a little further here in just a few minutes. So if you've been in one of my webinars before, you know that I'm not one for necessarily taking you through a lot of PowerPoint presentations. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in and take actually a look at some of these tools. So what I've got is I actually have a environment that we're going to be logging into. So if I go full screen here for you guys. So I'm using remote desktop to get access to a server in our lab environment. Well, with this machine, I have our Active Directory. And you see that I have my directory structure just like what you would inside of your district. Now, you'd have to use your imagination a little bit because this isn't necessarily a direct school system or things along those lines. But we see that we have our schools. We have school 1, 2, and 3 down here. I have my staff and my students. This is one way that you can set up your directory structure. Now, different school districts do their directories in a lot of different types of ways. Now, I'm going to recommend a couple of things to you guys today that you may want to look at. You don't necessarily have to. There are multiple ways that we can do things in which we connect to your Active Directory and pull and push your staff and OUs. So you see that we have our schools, and we can see that we have School 1, School 2, and School 3, where we're broken down by staff and then students. Well, we also have up here, underneath my Google Test OU, I have my staff, and then I have my students. Now, the reason that I have these broken down by my staff and students is because if I was going to apply policies to my staff in my Google Apps environment, and I want to apply different sets of policies to my students, or what applications they're allowed to have. Now, for instance, Google+. Google+, we don't necessarily want to turn on for your students. So what we can do is, if we're synchronizing in my Google Test OU up here, if I'm synchronizing this, I go to one spot in my Google Apps, I turn off Google+ for my students. If I turn off Google+ for my students there, it's turned off for all of my students. Where if I have my schools, I have each of my schools. Inside of each of my schools, I have my staff and my students. Then I have to go to each one of my schools and turn off Google+ for the students. Now, if you've only got 5 or 10 schools, that may not be an issue. But if you have 75, 60, 30, whatever the case may be, schools, you've got to go to each one of those student OUs in each of those schools and turn that feature off. Now, at the same time, I want to also take a look at how I've got my students broken down. Inside of the Google test, I've got my students and I've got my high school and my middle school. Well, I've broken down my high school to give me all of my high school students. Now, I've only got one high school student in there thus far, but I've also got my middle school that has all of my middle school students, so that if there was a user that I wanted to create, I wanted to have all of my high school students in here, I could have all of my middle school students, so that if in my high school OU I'm allowing Google Plus, I could re-enable it for my high school OU but turn it off for all of my middle schoolers. So you're going to want to spend some time and look at your Active Directory and how you have it set up for what you want to do. So I've also got a remote unit down here that's running my Google Apps Directory Sync. Now I've gone out, I've downloaded Google Apps Directory Sync, it then installs it on my machine, and underneath my All Programs, this is a Windows XP box. Now, you can have Google Apps Directory Sync installed on Active Directory or on your server. You can have it installed on Windows XP. You can have it installed on whatever the case may be that you want to do. So here I've got it installed on a Windows XP machine, and I go to Google Apps Directory Sync and then over to my Configuration Manager to launch it. Now by default, yours is going to come up and it's not going to necessarily have anything show up. Now for me, I've already loaded my Google Apps configuration file. You see that I have my GADS-K12gapps.xml. Now if I go to File and I go to New, and my machine's acting a little slow here, but you'll see it will come up and it will only have user accounts and groups highlighted for me to start. Now I see my Google Apps Directory Sync's not going to play nicely with me today. There it goes. So we see that it brought up 2, and I've got Google Apps user accounts and groups that are highlighted there. Now you're going to want to make this full screen, so if I right click and tell it to maximize, then I have access to my file window and I could go up and say Save As or Save. You're going to want to go ahead and save it from the get-go so that we can have access to make several different changes. Now I'm going to close that one. I've already got this directory sync preset up. So if I look at my general settings, I've highlighted organizational units. I've also got user accounts, groups, and user profiles checked. Now we can synchronize our organizational units so that we can push those just as we have them in Active Directory. I can push them directly up to Google. Now I've also got my user accounts. My user accounts being my individual users. And we're going to take a look at that and tell it what we want it to push up. And then we have our groups. Groups being security groups, email distribution groups, whatever the case may be. And that's going to be any groups that we assign an email address to. And then we have our user profiles. User profiles being additional information that we're going to push up to Google. Now, if you have shared contacts in your Active Directory or in your LDAP or eDirectory, we can push those up as well. So if you have a board member, your board members don't have email accounts on your system, but they have a shared account or a shared contact that you've posted inside of there so that we can populate that to the global address book of Google. So that you can have, if you've got a board member that's Sally Smith, Sally Smith's email address is sallysmith@roadrunner.com. Then it will post that to your global address book for all of your staff and students to be able to see. Now you may want to do that, you may not. So next we want to go on down to our Google Apps configuration. So I've got my Google Apps configuration here, and I see that I've got my primary domain name. This is your primary domain name for your Google Apps environment. So we've got k12gapps.mcnc.org. That's great. Now I see that I'm using here, you have two different options. You can utilize OAuth for your authentication, or you can use administrator credentials. If you have a separate admin account for your Google domain, for me, I prefer to use this method. Now, OAuth is the recommended practice by Google. That's completely up to you which way that you want to use. The reason that they recommend using the OAuth is because that portion will not change if a password was to change. But if you're synchronizing via a special user account, here you'll see that I'm using admin at K12GApps, and I've got that password in there because this is an account that will not change for me. So before we go through and test that, we need to make sure that we have actually granted authorization to this. So I want to bring up my administration console for this environment. So here I'm going to bring up a Chrome browser, and I'm going to go to admin.google.com. We have to make sure that we enable two different things before we can actually synchronize GADS. So if I log in, I'm going to log in as admin at k12gapps.mcnc.org, and then enter in my password, and I say sign in. I'm going to skip this portion. I don't necessarily need to add a mobile phone in here. So as I'm going to my administration console, you're going to notice that this is the older administration console. This console has not been updated as of yet. So if you've watched the previous webinars, you'll notice that we went through and we highlighted those different pieces inside of there. But for this one, I'm going to take you into this one. Oh, nope, we've gotten the new console here. Wonderful. So this just recently came in. So if I scroll down, I want to go to my security, bring up my security, and then I'm going to click on my API reference. Inside of the API reference, I want to make sure that I've enabled API access, which I have done, and then I want to scroll down to my advanced settings, and then I want to click on my Manage OAuth domain key. When I click on my Manage OAuth domain key, it's going to come up and grant me access to being able to enable the OAuth piece. Now once this loads, we're going to click on our checkbox next to enable the consumer secret. Notice that my OAuth consumer secret is k12gapps.mcnc.org. I enable the consumer secret, and then it gives me my OAuth consumer secret down below. Now, you're going to want to go ahead and tell it two-legged OAuth access control. Allow access to all APIs. This is going to be for your OAuth access. If you have multiple domains, you want to turn this on as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this on, and it's already on. I'm ready to go for that. So if I go back over to my Google Apps directory sync, we can now test the connection. I click on test connection. It should succeed for me and give me a green succeeded message. We see that this comes up. It's connecting, it's testing with Google Apps for me. So we had a question come in about if we have already have OUs set up in Google, does this override those or does it delete them? We're going to talk about that here in just a second with the organizational units. So we will be covering that. So we see that we've got a connection succeeded. And I'm going to go ahead and say close. Now I want to go down to my exclusions. I'm going to delete these two out. This was from the other day. And I can go down to my LDAP configuration. Notice that I've already gotten my LDAP configured here. I've told it that I'm using a Microsoft Active Directory, and I'm using standard LDAP. Now, you have the choice of going with an LDAP and SSL. if you're not sure whether you're using SSL or not, you're going to want to go ahead and leave it as a standard LDAP. And then I've got here my host name is my IP address. You can use your IP address or you can use your fully qualified domain name. It's up to you. Port 389 for my standard LDAP, and I'm using simple authentication. Now, I would not recommend using anonymous authentication. What this is going to do is basically it's going to walk across your LDAP or your Active Directory to be able to see, okay, your users, are they active or not active or whatever the case may be. So I've got my authorized user. Notice that I have my domain. My domain is CNE / and then CNE admin. And I've got my password here as well. With your authorized user, you can create a certain user to walk across your Active Directory. It's not making any changes to your Active Directory. All it's doing is walking across, looking at your users. For instance, if you created a special account for your Zscaler, if you're using Zscaler, you created an account to be able to look at your Active Directory, you can utilize that same account here on our Google Apps as well. So here I've got my base DN. Now, for my base DN, you notice that it's, if we take out this first part here, Google test, we have DC equals CNE, DC equals org. The reason that we have that is because if we minimize this here, you'll see that I've got cne.org. That's my domain. So we've got DC equals CNE, DC equals org. So I can bounce right back over there, and I have that base DN. Now we can test our connection to there. It's going to test our connection to our LDAP, and we should get a connection succeeded. If something was wrong, then we would not get that message. We would get a failure, and we'd have to go through and diagnose why we got that error message. Next thing, we want to go down to our org units. Now, I have this in there for the other day. I'm going to take it out. By default, nothing's going to show up there. Now, we go over to our search rules. Now, when we walk across our Active Directory, if you've already got accounts set up on Google, you've already got OUs that are out there and set up. Now, when we have our Google Apps directory sync, we're telling it, hey, we want to mimic our Active Directory environment and push that up to Google. So it's going to push your OU structure that you have inside of your Active Directory. Where if right now I have a different type of structure inside of Google. So if we go and look at my Google Apps environment, I should have left that open there, but we'll bring that back up here. So with our Active Directory, it's going to push our OU structure from our Active Directory up to Google to make it look the way that we want it to look. So now, if I log into my Google Apps environment, I'm going to go ahead and put in my password again. I don't know what happened. Oh. I actually authenticated into Chrome and not where I wanted to inside of the page. So we're going to bring open our page here. I'm in my admin console, and then I'm going to go to my users. Once this loads, I'm going to have to get some faster machines inside of our test environment here. So I go to my users, and here we can see my organizational structure. Right now I have, over on the left-hand side, I have my all grades, I have my Andy, Cert Test, David, GADS, things along those lines. But if we go back and look at our Active Directory, I don't have that environment showing up. So if we minimize this and we look at our Active Directory, I don't see anything labeled as GADS within that. So what it's going to do with GADS is it's going to delete the structure that's already there. And you're going to see that here in just a second. And we're going to be able to exclude some of that as well. So we'll come back and look at that again here in just a second. But we want to, in our search rules, if you can, you want to use the defaults. In this case, I clicked on the use the defaults, and it automatically gave me that piece. What it's going to do is it's going to search our organizational units in our directory structure, and it's going to automatically, if it finds an OU, it's going to push that OU up to Google. And then in our exclusion rules, we'll see that it automatically, it says, do not synchronize if deletions would exceed 5% of your organizations. Now, that is 5% of your organizational structure that is listed on Google Apps. So if you have 10 OUs that are already on Google and something happens to your Active Directory, 5 of those OUs that were in your Active Directory get deleted. It's going to hit a fail-safe. It's no longer going to synchronize that for you. So we're going to go ahead and leave that there, because if it was going to delete it, we don't want it to. So next we go down to our user accounts. So in our user accounts, we have our attribute here. So we've told it to use defaults, just like I said earlier, use defaults, and it automatically knows in 90% of the cases that we run across, we're going to use the email address attribute as mail. If you do not have the mail address populated, then it's not going to create that account on Google. So if there's a certain accounts that you don't want it to populate to your Google Apps, then we can turn off the mail attribute. We've also got our unique identifier attribute here. So we've got our object GUID. Object GUID is your unique identifier for your Active Directory. eDirectory may be differently. What the object identifier gives us the option to do is, if you delete out your Active Directory environment every year, or rather, in your Active Directory, a teacher gets married, teacher gets divorced, or just decides they want to change their name, then you can change their email address in your Active Directory and not necessarily have to change it up on Google. It will know based upon that unique identifier that, hey, this account's changed, I need to change the email address, and it will automatically do it for you up on Google without you having to do it manually on Google like you used to. So that's a great feature to have. Now, at the same time, if you delete out your students out of your directory structure every year and you add them back in, it's not a smart idea to use this for your students, because if we delete them all out and then recreate them every year in your Active Directory, they're going to have new unique identifiers every year. So if they have a new unique identifier every year, then that's not going to help us out, because it's going to give us errors. It's going to want to create new accounts every time because it's a new unique identifier. So if you're going to be deleting your students out every year, we're going to need to take this piece out and look at doing it a different way. Now, at the same time, we have our alias attributes, proxy addresses. So if you have multiple aliases for a user, or again, if a teacher gets married, divorced, or just wants to change their name, their email address, whatever the case may be, we need to make sure that we also automatically populate that within Active Directory. Now, if you want to let Google handle your proxy addresses, we can easily just remove that, and then you don't have to worry about it. Then Google will maintain the proxy addresses, and you won't have to maintain those in your Active Directory. Now, this goes through and it changes our defaults. It tells it to suspend Google Apps users not found in your LDAP instead of deleting them. That is the recommended practice. We don't want to delete your accounts immediately, because if you delete them, what if something was to actually go wrong? They ended up, they weren't actually leaving the district or something along those lines. We want to suspend their accounts, not necessarily delete them. And then also, don't suspend or delete Google Apps admins that are not found in the directory structure. Now we want to look at our additional user attributes. We have our given name. That's great. We want our given name. We want our family name, which is the surname, to fall inside of that area as well. Now when we hit our defaults, it's going to say only for new users, and this field's not going to be there as well. So we're telling it to use defaults, and it automatically populates several different things for us. So we're synchronizing passwords only for new users. Now, if you are synchronizing the passwords from your Active Directory environment for your students, we could tell it, okay, populate this field, and tell it to pull the password from a certain area. Now, the one that I recommend to folks is a hidden field called Alt Security Identities. This is just a way that you can populate students' passwords in a readable field that you can look at and be able to read that area later on. But by default, we want to populate a base password for our users, and then upon their login into Google, it will automatically require them to change that password. So we say only new users, and we want to force new users to change their passwords. And then we put in our default password of whatever you want it to be. And then we want it to be at least 8 characters if we can. Now, notice how we've got this force new users to change their password upon login. This is great if we are not using Google Apps Password Sync. If you are using Google Apps Password Sync, you're going to want to undo this checkbox. While yes, we want it to create accounts on Google, we don't want it to force them to change their password. We want to force them to change their password within the Active Directory environment. Let them change their password on Active Directory, and then it will push that password to Google for them. But in this case today, I want to go ahead and force these new users to change their password. And then we can go over to our search rules. We want to go ahead and tell it to use the defaults. The reason that we want to tell it to use defaults is because if we go and look at this one that it's created for us, we're going to see several different things. We see that it's added in the rule several things more than the recommended down at the bottom of just object class equals user. We notice that it's going through, it's telling it, okay, look for an object category of person, so it's got to be a person within your directory environment. And then it's going to say, okay, the object class is a user. Oh, the male attribute has to be populated. Now, if you're using a different attribute, tell it to create that account on Google, you're going to want to change that there. And then the other piece that it tells us is our user account control. Notice that we have our user account control mechanism, and then it's equaling 2. 2 being that it is an active account. If it's not an active account, it will not create the account on Google. So if you've suspended a user within your Google Apps environment, it's not going to create the account on Google. So we want to make sure that we have that 2 in there, and it will create accounts based upon if they are active accounts. Now, if you have only object class equals user in your rule field, it will create accounts in Google, and it will also read those accounts whether they are, it will leave them active whether they are suspended or active in your directory service environment. So we want to make sure that we are populating our Google Apps based upon them being a active user. And we could test that LDAP query if we needed to. We could tell it to go ahead and test it, and it's going to come up telling us several users that it sees right off the bat. While that's running, we had a question come in. In the unique identifier attribute, is it also true if you move students to new OUs? Not necessarily. So we see here, we'll go back to the question here in just a second, but we see we have our results come in. It looked up, it found C&E admin, and it's found several different accounts there. Great, so our query worked. If I go ahead and say OK, question came in about the unique identifier attribute. Is it also true that we need to have this for moving students in our OUs? No, we don't have to have this populated in order to get it to move people within the OUs. So no, we don't have to have that in order to move them between the different OUs. It's only if they are new users or suspended users in that aspect. In our exclusion rules, we also have our fail-safes here of do not synchronize or delete users if it's within a 5% of our organizational structure. Great. So if we go down to our groups, remember I said earlier with our groups we want to hit our defaults, and with our groups that we could create email distribution groups based upon the information that's in our Active Directory or eDirectory or whatever the case may be. Here we're telling it to look for the group, and then the mail attribute is populated. Now, if we go back to our Active Directory, we'll see that we have some, we can create a new group down inside of our high school students. I go in, I tell it's a new group. Well, you're very familiar probably with creating security groups. Well, in your security groups, you may or may not have an email address populated with it. Now, you can go in, if it's an already created group, you can also go ahead and populate a group there. So here we see we've got several security groups. If I go to AC Students, I notice that it's a security group, but then it also allows me to populate an email address. Go ahead and populate it with an email address, and it will create an email account on your Google Apps environment for that group. Now, if we go back over to our GADS, we'll see that we also were telling it our group email address attribute is the mail field of that, and our group display name is name. It's pulling all of these by default for us. We've told it to use the defaults. It automatically pulled these fields for us. That's great. This is what's used 90% of the time. If you had different attributes set for different things, then we can go ahead and change those to whatever you need them to be. The user email address attribute. What is the email address that it's wanting to use? Where you wanting to use the mail field. Then we have our members. Who are the members of that group? We're pulling that information from the member attribute. And then who is it managed by? It's managed by a certain group of users. We can put that inside of there. Now, if you are creating your groups on Google and you want to say, you want to allow an announcement only group, and you only want certain individuals to send to that group, those folks are going to be listed as owners, and it's going to be populated by this managed by field. Well, if that's not actually accurate, we're going to want to delete that and allow it to, that if we delete that portion out of the Active Directory environment, it will pull everybody from the members, and then you can add the owners via the Google Apps. So when is this used? This is used in cases where we have an all-district mailer, and then there's only your superintendent and 2 or 3 other people that are allowed to send to that all-staff mailer. We can then take this owner attribute out, and then we can go into the web interface and tell it the superintendent is an owner, and then those 2 or 3 other people that are allowed to send to that list are marked as owners as well. If we wanted, we could go through and do a test LDAP, and it will report back some of the groups, but we're not going to necessarily do that today. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel, and then I can go over to my exclusion rules, and I see that I have 5% there as well. So if it's going to delete over 5% of my groups, it's going to stop automatically and not run. I go down to my user profiles. I've already told it to use the defaults. This is great. This allows us to publish information to our global address book about our users. Well, we want to pull their title, maybe. in your title field of your Active Directory, you may be populating that they are a student or they're a teacher, or maybe, you know, certain information you could be publicizing out to your from your Active Directory to your Google Apps. For the company name, instead of populating their company, you may populate their school or different things along those lines. If you've got PowerShell scripts that you've already got set up, you can populate this information in your Active Directory fairly easily. As well, we can also do it in several other mechanisms. If you may have some different pieces of software, you can do it, or whatever the case may be that you may have. Now, the main fields that I see used a lot are the job title, the company name, and then the department. Now, we can also, if you're populating your students, we can give their graduation year. So we can populate their graduation year up on Google as well if you want to. Now, if you're using 5-digit dialing within your school district, you could put their telephone number up in the field as well. So if we go over to our search rules, we'll see that we've already added this piece in here as well. Now notice that we have this search rule. It's telling it to only create the profile if it's an active account within the Google Apps environment. That's a key feature as well, because if it's not an Active Directory account, then it's not going to want to create that account within the user profile area. And then in our exclusion rules, we could add exclusion rules for some other things. We're going to come back to these here in just a few minutes. Now, I talked about the shared contacts earlier. Shared contact being if you create a superintendent, or excuse me, a board member account, or somebody that's not in your Active Directory as an authenticating user, they're just as a contact. You could also populate that up to Google Apps as well. Now, I've skipped calendar resources a lot, because calendar resources gives you the capability to be able to synchronize calendars from your organization to Google. Now that also in turn gives you the way to create calendars to where people can reserve conference rooms, auditoriums, things along those lines. I don't recommend for schools using the online calendar resources, because that grants anyone in your organization access to reserving those rooms. So for instance, we're using a conference room here at MCNC today. Well, inside an individual company where everybody's housed in that building, it's great to have. But if we had 10 sites that we had that people were at, and people could go and reserve a conference room, well, maybe they don't necessarily really need access to that conference room. For instance, your boardroom. You may have a boardroom at your central office. Well, any student, if you had this as a calendar resource, could go and reserve the boardroom at your central office. Not a good thing to do. So what I recommend to folks is to create a calendar account within your school district. Create a generic calendar account. And then from there, you can then offer to your to your staff, whoever needs to be the ones to maintain that calendar can have access to it. Now, you could share that calendar with all of your staff if you wanted to, but you don't have to. So you've got the central office, and you have somebody that manages the calendars at the central office. Create all the calendars for the different boardrooms or conference rooms, and then put that out there for those folks to manage, to say, yes, somebody could have that room, no, they can't, or whatever the case may be. Or grant access to all the central office personnel to have access to that calendar for the central office. Now we go down to our notifications. We see that I've already put in our SMTP relay host. Notice that I have aspmx.l.google.com. The reason that I have that in there is because that's a relay host for Google. So I have my relay host as aspmx.l.google.com. On all of your copiers, your GADS machine or things like that need to be able to send email to people, you're going to want to use that relay host. Now as well, it's using port 25 to send that. So within your firewall, you're going to want to open up that port going outbound. Now, if you're doing something else, if you're going to be able to do authentication, you can actually use smtp.google.com to be able to send, or excuse me, smtp.gmail.com to be able to send out a authenticated user for sending emails. You must put a from address. I've got my from address as admin at K12NC or K12GApps.mcnc.org. And then I've told it a to address. You must fill out this information and have at least one to address before you can even run a simulation sync. Now, inside of mine, I've told it not to include extra details. Extra details are some things that you'll see that come about with extra details, such as there's extra profiles out there that you don't need or things like that. That's extra details that we don't necessarily want to see. Now, we don't have port 25 going outbound from this test environment allowed going outbound. So I've got that shut off, so my test notification will fail. I'm not worried about that with this environment. But for you, you're going to want to enable that open port 25 going outbound from your GADS machine and allow those types of things. Our logging, this is where our log file is going to be. Documents and settings, CNE admin, gads_sync.log. Now, by default, it's set to 4 gig in size. I've taken mine down to 2 gig in size. That's a large file to be a log file. So you may only want to take it down to 1 gig or, whatever the case may be. But I'm going to leave mine at 2 gig for now. And then I can go down to sync. Now, I like to tell it clear cache and simulate sync. Now, if I had errors or had something wrong, it's not going to let me simulate. It's going to give me an error up here and have it wrote out there what the error was. But because we've gone through the directory sync file and we've made sure everything is the way that we want it, we're good to go. Only click the blue button. Don't click the red button unless you're absolutely sure you want to apply those changes that you've done. So it's going to run through. It's going to simulate a sync here for us. So I had a question come in. What about creating the district calendars from the Google admin account? You can create the district calendars from the admin account if you want to, or create them from calendar accounts or whatever the case may be. That's completely up to you where you want to create those from. In either case, you can do it. I simply mentioned a calendar account. That way it's not tied to the administrator or tied to any certain user. Those calendar accounts you don't want to tie to certain users, because just like one district that I was speaking with yesterday, they've ran into the case of they set up the school calendars based upon individual people. Well, now that person is leaving the school district. Well, because they're leaving the school district, everybody's going to have to resubscribe to a calendar now because that person's leaving the district and the calendars were tied to that certain user. So by tying it to a calendar account, we don't have to worry about people coming and going, because the calendar will always stay there because it's underneath a generic account. So if you want to do it underneath your admin account, that's fine, or you can do it underneath individual users. So our LDAP validation is still running here. Now, whenever you actually run your synchronizations, they don't take as long as the simulations. The simulations will sometimes take a little bit longer. I've had one district that it actually took around an hour to an hour and a half to run a simulation one time. Now, that was because we were looking to synchronize somewhere around 40,000 accounts. So it took quite a while to run a simulation. Here we've done our simulation. It tells us that our retrievals are completed, our analysis is complete. So we see that we're going to analyze our organizations. We have 24 local and 12 are remote. Well, that's great. It sounds like there's actually a few more than what I want to be up there on Google, though. Our proposed changes, it says there's 12 extras. It's going to want to delete those. And then there's 26 that it wants to create that are new. Well, if I scroll down, remember all of those that were up there on Google that I said that, we don't necessarily, they're not in our Active Directory. So it wants to delete all of those OUs that are on Google. The ones that are A&D, Cert Test, all grades, everything along those lines. Well, we're going to go in and we're going to tell it that we don't want to delete those here in just a few minutes. We're going to exclude those from our directory. And notice that it tells us it wants to create all of these OUs. It wants to create 26 different OUs. Well, the reason it wants to create these 26 OUs is because it finds them in our Active Directory. Remember seeing that Google Test OU that I mentioned about the Google Test users? And then there's also the school OU that it found out there as well. There's a couple of different ways that we can change that to where it will only find different things. And we're going to go through and look at that here in just a second. So this is where we get into where we want to tweak our Google Apps directory sync. Now, here I've got my analyzed users. It found 8 local users and 45 remote users, and it wants to modify 37. The reason that is because there's a lot of accounts that we've got on our K-12 GApps that it's going to want to suspend. But then if we scroll on down, it's wanting to create 8 accounts. So we see it wants to create C&E user. It wants to create high school staff, which is a user. And then we have our C&E student accounts, student 1, student 2 that it wants to create. Notice that it tells us what organizational unit it wants to put those users in as well. So if I scroll back up here. So if we look at our high school staff, it wants to put that user in Google Test /staff/high school/HSS1. That's great. That's where we want to put that teacher at. Well, if we scroll on down past our users, we can see that it sees that there are 1 local group and 7 remote. There are 7 groups that are already out on Google. We see we have our administration, our elementary faculty, high, and it wants to delete all of those groups. But it wants to create the one account. It wants to create the one or modify the one of AC students at K-12 GApps. And it wants to create that one group, and then it's going to change their display name to AC students. Notice that I told you guys about the extra profiles. That's fine. We're fine with these 45 extra profiles. That's because their accounts exist on Google. We're going to suspend those accounts, though, if we wanted to. And then down there at the very bottom, we have our profile information. Notice that it's going to modify the C&E student to tell it to change their department to a 2014 graduate. That's great. We want it to post that information out there, so we can do that. We can also, we have an M. Brown here that's at West Bladen High. This was a user that somebody else was doing within our environment. So I need to modify my GADS some. I want to make some changes to where it won't actually, I don't want it to delete all of these organizational units that are on Google, because there are special OUs that those users don't exist in Active Directory. And then as well, I don't want it to create all of these Active Directory OUs. I only want it to do my Google Test area because that's where my accounts are that I want it to create. So the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my LDAP configuration, and I want to tell this, I only want it to look in my Google Test. So I'm going to say OU equals Google Test, comma, DC equals C&E, DC equals org. The reason that I chose that is because if I go back and I look at my Active Directory environment, I see my Google Test OU is directly underneath the cne.org. That's great. So now here I've told it to do that. Well, I'm going to copy that piece as well. So I tell it copy, and then I go down to my org units. Now, underneath the org unit mapping, currently I don't have anything there, but I want to add a mapping. The reason that I want to add this mapping is because if I don't, it's going to create an OU called org, OU called CNE, then an OU called Google Test. Well, I actually don't want it to create all those. I want it to only create staff and students. So I tell it, okay, for anything that's in the CNE test OU structure, I want it to push it all over to the left-hand side. So here it's going to automatically push all of those OUs over to the Google Apps name of / or to the root directory. I say apply and OK. Now it's going to go through and it's going to do that piece for me. Now if I go up to my Google Apps configuration and I go to my exclusion rules. Now remember guys, I told you that we don't want it to delete that all grades OU. So if I click up there, I can add an exclusion. Now if I'm in the Google Apps configuration, I'm in the Google Apps configuration area, I put exclusion rules in. These exclusion rules are so that it will not delete things that are up there on Google that don't exist in my Active Directory. So there's an OU that we have out there called All Grades. The reason that we have this out there is because maybe it's our service accounts. Service accounts being iPad email addresses or iOS email addresses that you don't want to have to create in your Active Directory. So a lot of folks have these iPads. You've got email accounts that are set up for it so that the emails come into that. So these are exclusions that we don't want it to create. So I'm going to put all grades in, and over here where it says match type, I'm going to tell it substring match because I can't remember necessarily if there was something in front of it or not. So I say apply and I say OK. Now I'm going to go back down to my sync and I'm going to tell it to simulate again. Simulate my sync again, and this should only take just a second. So notice that my LDAP search and my Google service retrievals went a lot faster that time because it's not having to look at as many OUs within the local LDAP environment. Analyzed organizations, I'm down to 10 local OUs instead of 26, as well as only looking at 8 remote. Now my all grades is gone. It's no longer wanting to delete that organizational units. Well, I still have that test one out there that we can go and get it to take away as well. Now if we look at our OU structure that it wants to create, notice how short it is. Now we only have staff and students, and then it's going to create those OUs that are directly below it. Now we're not going to have to click through staff, or excuse me, through org, CNE, and then Google Test to get access to our staff and students areas. It's going to automatically do that for us. Automatically pushes it over to the left-hand side. And then we go look at our users. It still wants to suspend these users because they don't exist in our Active Directory environment. That's fine. We're not going to worry about that at this time. But after we get down past these, it does want to create only one user, and because we only have one staff user that's inside of our high school staff account. That's fine. It wants to create that for us. Same thing with our groups. It wants to delete all those groups, and then it's going to fuss about our profiles there. Okay? This is, if I was happy with this report, I could tell it to sync and apply those changes. If I was not happy with it, I could go through and do some further modifications. Now what I want to do is I want to set up my automated process. I'm happy with my configuration file. Everything's the way that I want it to look. So I go through, I say File, Save As. I want to save this as my final copy. Now, whenever I go File, Save As, I like to save mine in a particular spot. I like to go in through the C drive, and then I like to go to the program files and my Google Apps directory sync. I like to save my file in the Google Apps directory sync area. That way I can easily access it at a later time. So I save that in my Google Apps directory sync area. I say save. It's save that file. Good deal. So I can go ahead and close out of my Google Apps directory sync. Then from my Windows XP machine, I'm going to set up a scheduled task. So I go All Programs, Accessories, and then I go down to my System Tools and Schedule Task. On a server environment or something else, you would want to do it as a scheduled task or as a task scheduler. So it's going to bring up my scheduled task, and I'm going to be able to create these here. So I add a scheduled task. I can say next. We can give this a name. We're got to tell it what application that we want to make it run. Well, I'm going to click on Browse, and then again I'm going to go to the Program Files, and I'm going to go to Google Apps Directory Sync, and inside of here we need to tell it sync-command. Okay, I want to open. I want this to run daily. Now, you can set up your GADS sync to run as little or as much as you want to. If you're automating your process of when your Active Directory is updated. So if you've got scripts that are set up to run and activate your Active Directory, create new accounts at 6 o'clock in the morning every day or at 12 o'clock noon every day, well then you probably want to set up your task scheduler to run after that process is done. So maybe at 1 o'clock p.m. or 7 a.m., depending upon when you have your stuff set to run, that it will create your accounts. I'm going to give this a name of GADS K12 GApps. I tell it to run daily, weekly, hourly, however you want to make it run. I'm going to choose daily for this instance. Now, my time, I want it to run at 3 p.m. I can tell it every day, every weekday, or every 2 days, whatever the case may be. I'm going to choose this to start on Saturday, just because I want a little extra time to tinker and make sure everything is the way that I want it to be. I can say next. It's going to ask me to prompt for my password. And then next. Now, with that password, you're going to have to remember, anytime your server administrator password changes or anything like that, you're going to need to go and update that password. Otherwise, your GADS will stop running. So I'm going to tell it to open my advanced properties so that I can look at some additional things with inside of there. I'm going to say finish. And now it brings up, it tells me it's going to run sync-command.exe. And it's going to start in the Google Apps Directory Sync folder. That's great. Next thing I want to do is in my run area, I'm going to put a space at the end, -A, because I want it to actually run. And then I'm going to put a space, -C, because we want to tell it what our configuration file is. And then we're going to put in the name of our configuration file. I believe mine was GADS-K12GApps.xml. Now, I need to verify that. So I'm going to browse back to my computer, my hard drive, my program files, and then Google Apps Directory Sync. What was the name of that? GADS K12 GApps. Great. That is the name. I'm going to copy that just in case. And because I do have some capital letters there that I shouldn't have typed in, I'm going to paste that to make sure that I got my name correct. Now, it is an XML file that I need to post out there. And I want to run it as CNE admin. Now, underneath our schedule, we could tell it to run daily, 3 p.m. If you wanted to run yours more than that, you could go into the advanced and tell it to repeat the task every hour or every 10 minutes, or however you want to do it. Okay? Or you could show multiple schedules to where you can create multiple schedules, one to run at 12 o'clock every day, one to run at 4 o'clock every day, or whatever the case may be that you want to set yours up to run as. And then everything else should be good to go. We say apply, put in our password again, and say OK. Okay. Now I've got my GADS scheduler set to run. It's going to start at 3 p.m. every day starting tomorrow on 12/14. That's great. It's going to run my process as soon as I'm ready to run. So now, this will start and it will run. Now, if I have my email, port 25 open, it will send that email directly after it runs every day. So about 3:10 p.m. every day, I should receive an email letting me know that GADS ran. If I don't receive that email, I know something's wrong. I need to go and look. As well, if it fails, it will also send you an email as well. But if you don't get anything at all, something's probably wrong with your GADS machine. So you're going to want to go back in and look at that environment. GADS is up and running for us. That's wonderful. We're on to the next step. Well, we've talked several times about Google Apps Password Sync. Well, Google Apps Password Sync works for your Active Directory environment. Now, it only works with Active Directory because what it does is it intercepts when you go to change a user's password. So we have underneath our high school 1, we have our staff member here. Well, if I go in and I tell it to reset his password, I could change his password from here. Well, we can change the user's password from here, and it will automatically push their password up to Google Apps. That's great. That's what we want it to do every time. So what we can do is set up Google Apps Password Sync. Now, if we go through, whoops, I didn't mean to close out that window. That's okay. We can bring it back up. If I go to my documents, inside of my downloads, I have Google Apps Password Sync here. As soon as I look, I've got Google Apps Password Sync that's been downloaded. Now, notice that it says 32.msi. This is a 32-bit machine. There is a 64-bit that's available for you to download as well. I've already downloaded and installed it on my machine here, but I could go to Google Apps Password Sync and choose that option to be able to go and look at it. Yes, I need to grant access permission to it. Comes up about Google Apps. Now, notice that they're still in release version 1.1. Now, this software is still early in the process, but it's been out for a year and a half, close to 2 years now. But we can go through, we see that we've got to configure provisioning API. Now, remember, we've already done that in our control panel. We've already gone out, we've turned on the API access, and we've told it for all our OUs. Great. So our next steps, we can go ahead and go next. I've told it my Google Apps domain is k12gapps.mcnc.org, and my admin ID, email ID, is admin@k12gapps.mcnc.org. Now, I want to have a conversation. So my recommendation and Google's recommendation are a little bit different. So I recommend setting up an admin email account for each one of your domain controllers. The reason that I say that is because we have run into some pieces in the past. I've got a school district, they've got 30 schools. Well, we had some issues when 30 servers were trying to push password changes to Google with the same username at one time. So what I like to do is actually separate this out, and if this was my central office server, I could go CO admin, or I could say, you know, I'm just going to say Research Triangle Park admin, or whatever the case may be. You could put your school letters in front of it, create all of those admin accounts on Google so that you can have it set to push these passwords up. Now, this also allows you in your log files, when a password gets changed from your Active Directory environment, it's logged in your log files on Google. So it would be logged to let you know that that teacher changed their password on the Research Triangle server, or they changed their password on the central office server, or whichever server that they changed their password on. It allows you to be able to see that. Where if you're using just one password here, excuse me, one username and password, you're not going to be able to see that. You're only going to see the one. So now I want to click Authorize Now, and it's going to pop up asking me. Well, by default, it's already got my email address, and it's got Remember Me. That's great. I say Continue. It's now launching my preferred browser, which on this machine is Firefox. It brought me up to the custom page. I enter in my password, sign in. No, we don't. I want to accept because we're granting that user API access to manage the provisioning of users in a domain. Well, you've got to have that access to be able to reset passwords. Authorization's been granted. Wonderful. I can close that, and it tells me that I'm authorized to make those changes. I go ahead and say Next. And then we've got to be able to walk across your Active Directory again, because this time we've got to be able to see when passwords were changed. The way that Password Sync works is it's installing a DLL on your server so that when a password is being changed, it intercepts it, encrypts it, and pushes it to Google Apps. So I'm going to use again my CNE /CNE admin. I've got my password in, and I've told it that base DN of Google test _ DC equals CNE.org. The reason I've done that is because I only want it to look for changes with that base DN. If it's in any other OU, remember there was a school test area, I don't want it to look for password changes in that area. I only want it to do password changes within the Google test environment. And then I want it to look in the mail attribute. The mail attribute is a key factor here. Now, the mail attribute being, this is what tells GAPS what account to change on Google Online, the Google Apps dashboard. So it's going to say, hey, I found this user, their password was changed. Their email address is this. And then it passes that along to Google Online and says, hey, here's the password, here's the account that we need to change it. And it makes those changes for you. So we can go ahead and say Next. The service has not been started. The reason that the service has not been started here is I've ran this several different times on this machine for practicing and as well for prepping and everything. So next, it would want me to, after you install the software on your Active Directory server, it does require a reboot. I have not rebooted this server yet, so it's not going to tell me that the service is started. So, but if I was to actually go in and go to my services, let's go administrative tools, and then services. We'll see inside of services, if we scroll down to Google, we'll see the Google Apps password service. I need to start that service. So it started and stopped. This machine still needs a reboot. Okay. Now, if I was to say finish, notice that it says my configuration saved, but my service is stopped. If I reboot this server, the Google Apps password sync will start running, and then as soon as I change a password on my Active Directory environment, the password will be pushed up to Google. So the question came in is, can you or should you turn off password sync in GADS and use GAPS instead, assuming AD is the only environment that you have? So inside of our GADS environment, we do have to uncheck that force new users to change their password. But as well, if you are managing your students' passwords, so inside of our accounts here, we have our students, we have our high school student. If we are maintaining the students' passwords, we go into the properties for it, and we're pushing policies, we're not allowing our students to change their password, then yes, you could use GAPS to maintain your students' passwords instead of using GADS. Well, if you're not in an Active Directory environment, or you don't want to install it on all your machines, or whatever the case may be, then no, you don't necessarily want to use GAPS. But with GADS, you can maintain passwords by telling it what attribute to use, or in this case here, we can use Active Directory and GAPS to maintain students' passwords, because we're allowing staff to change their passwords, but not students. And this GAPS also works with your web-based password recovery systems. So if you're allowing your staff to go into a website and change their password, or students, or whatever the case may be, they answered 3 or 4 different questions and then they're allowed to change their password. That system will in turn work with Google Apps Password Sync. I have that running with a couple of community colleges where they've got the password recovery modules, things along those lines, that will work within this environment as well. So that's GAPS in a nutshell, where we've gone in, we've set up Google Apps Password Sync. The hardest part is you have to install the software on the server, allow the server to reboot, and then you'll be able to access it. So the other thing that I want to talk to you guys about today is Google Apps Manager. So I've gone out already. I've already gone out and downloaded the software, but if we were to go out to Google Chrome, I'm going to bring up a web browser here. We could go out and go to Google Apps Manager. It is put out by a third-party company, not Google. It's put out by a third-party company called Ditto. So if I go to the web page for Ditto, or go to the code page, it is available for you to use at no charge. Come on. Something always breaks when you don't want it to. So we're going to try to load up the Google Apps Manager site. So notice that it's a Google code page. It's available at no charges, available free for you to use. Ditto is the company that produces the product. It was actually developed by a gentleman named Jay, who had it as a personal project, but then the company that he worked for, Ditto, actually absorbed it, and he's now offering it through there. So you can go to downloads and then download the version that you need to get. I recommend the 3.03 version currently. They're still in alpha on 3.1, but you can get version 3.3 whether it is 64-bit or 32-bit. I have downloaded the 32-bit version. Now if I just minimize this here, you'll see that I've downloaded it. It's in my downloads directory as GADS 303 windows.zip. When you open that, you see you have a folder called GAM. What I like to do is drag and drop that GAM folder on my C drive. So underneath my computer, my C drive, you'll see that I've already dropped that GAM folder inside of there. When you open it, you see there's several different pieces there. So if I bring up a command line Notice that I did mention earlier that this is a command line tool. I can go to my C drive and I can go to GAM, CD GAM. Now, from here, I can also, I want to go GAM info domain. Now, I have not set up GAM on this machine, so I'm going to say enter. It asks me, hey, you need to be able to access all of these resources, or which ones do you want to access? Well, for me, I want to access all of those resources, so I say 18, tell it to enter, and then it brings up a browser. I've got to authenticate and grant access to that. Well, I've got admin at k12gapps.mcnc.org. Done. Whoops. Let's go back in there again. Let's try that one more time. It's not liking that for me right now. Let me copy that. So a question for that came up in the pre-session today is, how many machines does it take for John to do a webinar? Earlier, before today's session got started, I was logged into a VPN that was remote desktoped into a server that was remote desktoped into a client machine that was then remote desktoped, or excuse me, Citrix into another machine to be able to get a couple of files that I was needing. So I think Tim counted somewhere around 4 or 5 machines that I was logged into at one time. So if this errors out on us, there's something not right here. Something's happened. I'll come back to that at a later time. But I always have plan B for our environment. So if I take this out of full screen, I can actually log into my Citrix environment, which I'll do so. And I have GAM running in that environment as well, which I wanted to log into anyhow and show you guys a couple of things that I do. As many of you know, you've worked in education long enough that nothing goes exactly the way that you planned it to go during that time frame. So I'm logged into my Citrix environment. Notice that I've already got a Citrix environment running here. So inside, if I go to my N drive, you'll see that I've got a lot of GAMS folders that are stuck out here. Because I work with a lot of the districts already, I've worked with a lot of school districts, so I've got GAM folders created where I've done several different types of things for you. So if I go to CD GAM dash, let me blow this up for you guys. If I go CD GAM and then K12G apps, because that's the folder that I've got created with this, I can go GAM info domain. It's just telling me GAM 303 is out. That's okay. It's reading through. It tells me here, GAM info domain, that I've got 2,000 users that I can create. Well, that's fine, well and good. Let's see. I can create 2,000 users. I've only got 45 that I'm using at this time. That's great. Well, from a command line interface, I can do GAM create user jsmith at k12gapps.mcnc.org space first name James space last name space, and then Smith. If you had spaces in your last name, so Smith, Alexander, I need to make sure that I put those in quotes. Space. I want to put his password to be change me with an ampersand. Or excuse me, I need to put that E to a 3 so that I make it a complex password. Change me with an ampersand space change password on, so that I'm requiring James to change his password upon his login. And then I can also tell it to OU that I want it to put him in. I put him in the org. I want to put him in the test OU that's on Google Apps. Well, I probably want to put /test. Now, you can also put another to go further down in the structure if you wanted to, but for now, I'm going to easily just put this as test. And I hit enter. It's telling me it's creating an account, and then it's giving me an invalid OU because the OU test does not exist. So let's just bring up here. Let's bring up my Chrome. So if I go to my management, we're going to see now inside of here my users. We're actually, let's just do a search. I do a search. It's not finding James as of yet because we just created his account. But inside of here, it will create his account where James is there. Has not put him in the environment online. Notice that I did have a test OU, so why did that fail? Let's go back and change that to org test. I hit enter, create J Smith. Now it created his account and put him supposed to be in the test org. So now we see James Smith Alexander has been created in the test environment. Now, of course, you want to test these things out. Now, I mentioned that they can be scripted. Well, how can they be scripted? Well, if you have a CSV file, you can automatically generate things. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a script to tell me all of my accounts that I have. So from here, I can do gam print all users, because I want it to print all of my users out and tell me who they are. Well, the fields that I want it is I want all fields. I want all the fields that Google sees. And then I want to pipe that out to a CSV file. And I'm just going to name it allfields.csv. I hit enter. It reads through my Google Apps, brings me out all of those pieces. Now if I do a dir, you see I've got allfields.csv that's inside of there. So I need to go and access that CSV file. So we open it up, and we see that it gives us an error. It's not like in my gam print. That's fine. So what do we need to do? We go out to Google Apps Manager site. We have this wiki space. This is your area to figure out how to do a lot of different types of things. No, I don't remember all the commands, so I need to make sure I go and take a look. So if I want to print the users, I've got printing all users, printing all groups, printing all aliases, whatever the case may be. I want to print all of my users. So I got gam print users all fields. Okay, so that's where I messed up. I know that I told it to print all users. So I want to tell it GAM print users all fields, and I want it to pipe it to allfields.csv. It's doing that. This time it did it correctly. It told me there were 46 users. So now if I go and I launch that all fields, notice that it gave me all of my fields with a lot of more information than what you can get from the administration console. So for instance, I have their email address, I have their first name, last name, I have their full name, their first and last name together, their username, that's their email address without the @ I also have something that you don't get anywhere else in the administration console. I can get a printout of where everybody's at in my OU structure. That's great. You don't get this anywhere else except through using a command line tool such as this or some other third-party tool. I can also see all of my suspended accounts at one time. So I can also, if all of these were actually true, so all of these accounts were set to true, I could filter. So we're doing a cleanup at the end of our year. I want to filter this, and I want to say I only want to see the suspended users. So I only want to see the true suspendeds. Well, these are all of our suspended users. Okay. If they were suspended online, it would actually give us a reason why they were suspended. And for the most part, that will say admin. If the change password field was selected, this would be true. So if actually Chrome 1 and Chrome 2 were being required to change their password, those would say true. This is a way that you can use this to see if someone ever actually logged into their account. If they did not, it would say true still. The agreed to terms, do they have delegation turned on? Are they delegating their admin access? Are they an administrator? Well, we see that John and Andy are administrators here, so they're set to true while the others are set to false. We can see when their accounts were created. My account was created 3/15/2012 here. Their last login, last time they logged in. If they have aliases, let's see. If they have aliases inside of your domain, you can pull their aliases from here. This is a report that I use a lot that I can go through and filter. Then we also have the include in the global address book. Now, we've got a lot of school districts that you may choose to have your students show up in the global address book. You may not. This is the tool that I use to go through and tell it don't include students in the global address book. So I'll choose all of your students. What I'll do is I'll run a filter on their email address to tell me, okay, anybody that has @student.whatever, I'll run a filter on it, and then I'll write a little script to tell it to do something for me. So if I insert a cell here, I could say, okay, equal GAM for here. These users are suspended, so I want to delete them. Delete user space the and symbol. I want to tell it G2 because that's the user I want to delete. I hit enter. Whoop, sorry, not G2. We want to tell it A2 because I want to delete the admin user. Because his account is suspended, it's been suspended over a year now, I need to delete it. I can then also tell it to go ahead and delete all of those others. If I wanted to delete these users, I copy it and I paste it into my command line, and it will go ahead and go right through and delete those users for you. Now, you can do a lot of things with inside of here. If I did not want these users to show up in the global address book, I could do GAM user and GAL global address lookup space false. Hit enter. Now I will run this one. I could say copy, and I could tell it to paste that into my command line, and then it will, whoop, let's go back and look at this again. Notice that I've got my GAM print users. That's saying gal. If I update a user, update the user, we can go through, gal is either on or off. So I want it, instead of saying false, I want it to say off. Highly recommend bookmarking that GAM site because the commands change with different versions. So now I can paste that in there. Now it's going to take those users and take them out of it. The reason it's giving me this is because I'm actually running an older version. And I'm actually running the old GAM 2.5 down here. And I can go back to it. And like I said, they changed the pieces around. And they took out that from the old version. So, but if I had the new version, and I've done this several times, if we were to go back to one of the other districts that we've ran this with, you can see that those users were removed from the global address book. So for instance, if I was to go through, these guys are here with me today, so hopefully they don't mind if I use it. If I go down to Wayne County Schools, you'll see that there's several ones that we've done through here with them. So I've got several scripts that we've wrote. We've done different things such as moving students around. There's no passwords in this one, so I can edit this one and show you guys this. So we've said, okay, GAM update user, a user, we put their password in, then we told it to change their password off when we told it their OU that they're in and things along those lines. We can tell it to suspend. So here we went through and we told it to suspend all of these users. Suspended is on. So that way when we ran this BAT file, it would suspend all of those users. You can paste the information into Notepad, save it as a .bat file. So we go File, Save As, change it to all text, change it to a .bat. So that it's a batch file, and then you can tell it to run and suspend all of those users, create all those users, unsuspend the users, whatever the case is that you want to run for that account. You can run that and delete those accounts or whatever the case may be through there. So you can see how you can run all of these different pieces. A lot of different things that you can do to make it worth your while within the command line. Highly encourage you to go take a look at the GAM, the wiki space, to where you can run the different pieces. Now, you can also, some things that I've been talking with a couple of folks about, a couple of school districts and community colleges, they want to force users to have a certain picture. Or the district, you want to just post people's pictures by default and then they can go in and change it. Or you want their picture to be their school ID picture. For instance, if we look at mine, not this account, if we go look at my email, you've seen it before. It's got a picture of me over on the right hand side and everything along those lines. You can push that picture up to your users. See here, I've got this picture here. It's just a normal run-of-the-mill picture. You can push those pictures to the user's profile. So I've got one school that wants to pull their yearbook pictures and push those for their students up to Google. You take the picture, you match the picture to the student, and we can push that up to Google Apps for it. There's a lot of different things that you can do with inside of here. Now, you can also, from the Chromebook side, from the Chromebooks, we can go down, we can take a look at our Chromebook devices. We can update the information on our Chromebooks. If you have a Excel file, Google spreadsheet file, CSV file that you can edit that has your Chromebook data in it, we can run little scripts that will update the information in your admin console. So if we look in our admin console here, whoop, wrong one. No, that was, sorry. So we go through, we see our devices here. Love it when I get moved around and I'm not prepared for it. So we've got our devices within the Google Apps environment that you can see. As well, we have it here that we can maintain that information here. We can also print it out. We can print the information, run a report, see who's got what device, see how many licenses we have, different types of things along those lines. You can run those different pieces. And that, in a nutshell, is Google Apps Manager. You can also manage your group settings. You can manage your calendar settings. If you wanted to force all users to have subscribed to a certain calendar, you've got your district calendar that's being done through Google Calendar. You can force all of your users to be subscribed to that calendar if you wanted to. I've got one group that wants to do that as well. So there's a lot of different types of things that you can do. So we've reached the end of our presentation for today. Today's presentation is not quite as long as the rest of them. I want to encourage you to make sure that you sign in for today. We will be sending out an evaluation to ask folks for your feedback. We will also be giving CEU credits if needed for your training for today. If you have any questions, we're going to pause real briefly for questions. Currently, I don't have any that have came in recently, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and post those. As well, reach out through email or phone call to me if you have any questions specific to just your district. We can do that as well if you want to. Again, I want to thank you guys for coming out today. We're going to have some additional Google Apps trainings that are coming up within the next week or 2 weeks, probably after the Christmas holidays. We're going to be having a webinar on the Chromebook testing, how you can make your Chromebooks a secure browser environment for the North Carolina online testing. We'll be sending out some information on that here in the near future when we're ready to post that information. Thank you guys for attending. If you don't have any more questions, thank you, and we will see you next time.